car should not have been there. When the construction crew broke through the sealed chamber wall on March 22, 2021, deep inside the abandoned Silver Ridge mine in Nevada, their headlamps illuminated something that made the foreman radio for the site to be evacuated immediately. A 1971 Dodge Charger, forest green with a black vinyl top, sat perfectly centered in a natural cavern approximately 40 feet below ground level, its chrome bumpers still gleaming despite nearly half a century in darkness. The doors were locked from the inside. The keys hung in the ignition. A military duffel bag sat in the passenger seat, and a Navy SEAL Trident insignia hung from the rearview mirror, catching the light like a warning. The car belonged to Lieutenant James Matthew Harrington, who had vanished without a trace on the night of November 8, 1972. After leaving Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in San Diego, telling his commanding officer he needed to drive to Nevada to handle a family matter and would return within 48 hours. He never came back. His family never heard from him again. And for 49 years, every investigator, every search team, every person who looked for James Harrington had operated under one fundamental assumption, that he had disappeared somewhere on the surface, that his car had gone off a desert road or been hidden in some remote location accessible by normal means. But the chamber where his Charger now sat, undisturbed by dust or time, had been geologically sealed since 1973, buried under a tunnel collapse that occurred 14 months after James vanished, entombing the vehicle in a space that, according to mine engineers and structural geologists, should have been completely inaccessible since before the car was ever placed there. Silver Ridge Mine had been a moderately successful silver extraction operation from 1902 until 1968, when declining ore quality and rising operational costs forced its closure. The mine consisted of approximately 18 miles of tunnels spread across 7 levels, descending nearly 600 feet into the earth beneath the Nevada desert 40 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The closure had been orderly, with equipment removed, valuable materials salvaged, and the main entrances sealed with concrete and steel gates designed to prevent unauthorized access. But like many abandoned mines in Nevada, Silver Ridge had a reputation that kept most people away even without official barriers. Locals spoke about strange sounds emanating from the sealed entrances on certain nights, mechanical grinding, and what some described as voices echoing up from depths that should have been silent and empty. There were reports throughout the 1970s and 1980s of lights seen moving underground, visible through ventilation shafts that penetrated to the surface, though no one could explain how lights could be operating in a mine that had been without power for decades. In March 1973, 4 months after James Harrington's disappearance and 600 miles from where he was last seen, a significant structural collapse occurred in the 3rd level of Silver Ridge Mine. The collapse was attributed to water infiltration weakening support timbers, causing a cascading failure that brought down approximately 200 feet of tunnel and sealed off several chambers that had been carved into natural limestone caverns during the mine's operational years. The collapse was noted in county records, the entrances were inspected to ensure the seals remained intact, and the incident was filed away as an expected consequence of abandoning underground infrastructure without ongoing maintenance. No one entered the collapsed section. There was no reason to. The mine had no commercial value, represented no immediate danger to the public, and existed in an area so remote that hikers and explorers rarely ventured near it. James Matthew Harrington had been 28 years old when he vanished, a Navy SEAL with 6 years of service, and a record that marked him as one of the most reliable operators in his unit. He stood 6 feet tall, weighed 185 pounds, had dark brown hair kept in the regulation military cut, and possessed the kind of quiet competence that made commanding officers trust him with the most sensitive operations. He had completed 2 tours in Vietnam, had been decorated for valor during a classified mission that his family would never learn the details of, and had recently returned to Coronado for what was supposed to be a period of stateside training and rest before his next deployment. James came from a military family. His father, Colonel Robert Harrington, had served in World War II and Korea. His older brother, David, was a Marine Corps officer. His younger sister, Caroline, had married an Air Force pilot. The Harringtons understood duty, understood sacrifice, and understood the peculiar silences that military service sometimes imposed on families. When James called his father on November 7, 1972, and mentioned that he needed to drive to Nevada to handle something related to family property. Robert had not pressed for details. The Harrington family owned a small parcel of land in Nevada, inherited from James's grandfather, who had been a prospector in the 1920s. The land was worthless, 40 acres of desert scrub far from any town, but it had sentimental value and remained in the family name. James said he needed to check on something related to that property, that he had received a letter from the county about a survey or boundary dispute, and that he would drive up, handle it, and be back within 2 days. James left Coronado on the evening of November 8, 1972, driving his distinctive green and black Dodge Charger, a car he had purchased 6 months earlier and maintained with the same meticulous care he applied to his equipment and weapons. He stopped for gas in Barstow, California, around 9:30 p.m., paying cash and chatting briefly with the station attendant about the weather and road conditions. The attendant, a retired Navy man himself, remembered James clearly because of the seal trident hanging from his rearview mirror, and because James had mentioned he was headed to Nevada to deal with some property business. That was the last confirmed sighting of James Harrington by anyone outside his family or military circle. When James failed to report back to base by November 10th, his commanding officer initially assumed there had been a delay, some complication with whatever family matter had taken him to Nevada. But when November 11th passed with no contact, when phone calls to James's parents revealed they had not heard from him either, the concern escalated rapidly. Navy investigators were dispatched. Local law enforcement in Nevada was contacted. Search teams began working backwards from Barstow, trying to trace James's route. The investigation quickly determined that James had indeed been headed toward the family property in Nevada, a conclusion based on the direction he had been traveling when last seen and the fact that the property was roughly in line with his stated destination. But the property itself, when investigators visited it, showed no signs of recent activity. There were no tire tracks, no indication anyone had been there in years, no structures beyond a collapsed wooden shack that had been abandoned decades earlier. The surrounding desert was searched by teams on foot and by helicopter. No vehicle. No signs of accident or struggle. No trace of James Harrington. The Dodge Charger, distinctive enough that it should have been noticed if abandoned anywhere accessible, had seemingly vanished as completely as its driver. Law enforcement checked impound lots, junkyards, border crossings into Mexico. They interviewed James's friends, examined his finances, looked for any indication of personal troubles or reasons he might have chosen to disappear. They found nothing. James had been financially stable, emotionally sound, committed to his career, close to his family. There was no girlfriend drama, no secret debts, no hidden life that might explain a voluntary disappearance. And for a Navy SEAL, trained in survival and evasion, to vanish so completely that not even his vehicle could be found was disturbing in a way that suggested something had gone very wrong. By early 1973, the official investigation had stalled. James Harrington was listed as missing, presumed dead, though no body had been recovered, and no definitive evidence of his fate had been established. His family, devastated but unable to grieve properly without closure, held out hope that somehow James would be found, that the mystery would be solved. Years passed. His father died in 1985, never knowing what had happened to his son. His mother followed in 1997, carrying the same unanswered questions to her grave. By 2021, James's sister Caroline was 74 years old, the last surviving member of the immediate Harrington family, living in a retirement community in San Diego, and long resigned to never learning the truth about her brother's disappearance. The construction crew that discovered James's Charger in March 2021 had been hired by a mining company evaluating the possibility of reopening Silver Ridge Mine for mineral extraction using modern techniques. The evaluation required accessing old sections of the mine to take core samples and assess the remaining ore deposits. Workers used controlled explosives to breach collapsed sections, clearing rubble and opening passages that had been sealed for nearly 50 years. When they broke through into the third-level chamber where James's car sat, the initial reaction was confusion. Why would there be a vehicle underground? How had it gotten there? Was this some kind of prank or art installation? It was the foreman, a man named Robert Chen who had 23 years of experience in mining operations, who recognized that something was profoundly wrong with what they were seeing. The car was not damaged. It was not rusted or corroded despite decades in the damp environment of an underground cavern. It sat on all four tires, which should have been flat but appeared properly inflated. The cavern around it showed no signs of an entrance large enough to drive a vehicle through, no ramp or passage that could have accommodated bringing a car to this location. And when Robert examined the walls of the chamber more closely, he saw that the rock showed natural weathering patterns and mineral deposits that suggested the space had been sealed for far longer than the car had been in existence. Robert ordered the site evacuated and called local law enforcement. Within hours, FBI agents arrived, along with mining engineers, geologists, and eventually military investigators when the car's registration was traced to a Navy SEAL who had been missing since 1972. The Dodge Charger was photographed from every angle. The chamber was mapped and analyzed, and specialists worked to understand not just whose car this was but how it had come to be in a location that should have been geologically impossible to access. The vehicle was in remarkable condition for its age. When investigators carefully picked the locks and opened the doors, they found the interior preserved as if the car had been parked just days ago rather than decades. The upholstery showed minimal wear. The dashboard instruments were intact. James Harrington's military duffel bag sat on the passenger seat, and when opened, it contained a change of civilian clothes, toiletries, a flashlight, and a waterproof case holding maps of Nevada and documents related to the Harrington family property. The glove compartment held the car's registration, proof of insurance dated 1972, and a service manual. The trunk contained basic tools, a spare tire, and a military-issue first aid kit. But there was no sign of James Harrington himself. No remains, no blood, no indication of what had happened to the driver after the car arrived in this impossible location. The keys in the ignition were in the off position. The fuel gauge read nearly empty. The odometer showed mileage consistent with a drive from San Diego to somewhere in the Nevada desert. Everything suggested James had driven to this location, parked, and then simply ceased to exist. The geological analysis of the chamber produced findings that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The cavern was a natural limestone formation that had been discovered during the mine's operation and partially incorporated into the third-level tunnel system. The entrance to the cavern, which had once connected to the main tunnel, had collapsed in March 1973, 4 months after James's disappearance. The collapse had been thorough, bringing down tons of rock and sealing the cavern completely. Core samples taken from the collapsed section showed undisturbed stratification, meaning the rock had not been moved or disturbed since the collapse occurred. There was no hidden passage, no alternative entrance, no way that a vehicle could have been driven into the chamber after March 1973. But James had vanished in November 1972, 4 months before the collapse. The timeline suggested an impossibility. If the car had been placed in the chamber before the collapse, then James would have had to drive it there, while the tunnel was still open, would have had to navigate through miles of mine tunnels designed for rail carts and foot traffic, not vehicles, and would have had to do so without anyone noticing or documenting the presence of a civilian car in an abandoned mine. If the car had been placed after the collapse, then it would have required moving tons of rock, accessing the sealed chamber, driving the vehicle in, and then perfectly reconstructing the collapse to make it appear undisturbed. Neither scenario made sense. FBI Special Agent Lisa Martinez was assigned to lead the investigation into what was now being treated as a potential homicide, despite the absence of a body. Lisa was 46 years old, had spent 20 years with the Bureau working cases that ranged from missing persons to organized crime, and had developed a reputation for solving cases that other investigators had given up on. When she stood in that underground chamber, looking at James Harrington's Charger sitting impossibly in the middle of a geologically sealed space, she felt the same sensation she had experienced only a handful of times in her career, the certainty that she was looking at something that would challenge every assumption she had about how the world worked. Lisa began by reconstructing James's last known movements. She obtained the original case files from 1972 and 1973, interviewed people who had known James, and tracked down the gas station attendant from Barstow who had been one of the last people to see him alive. She drove the route James would have taken from San Diego toward his family's Nevada property, looking for anything that might explain a detour to Silver Ridge Mine. The mine was not on a direct route to the Harrington property. To reach Silver Ridge, James would have had to deviate significantly from his stated destination, would have had to drive into an area he had no apparent reason to visit. Lisa investigated James's military service, looking for any connection between his SEAL missions in Nevada, any classified operations that might have brought him to this area. She obtained clearance to review James's service record, spoke with surviving members of his unit, and examined after-action reports from his deployments. She found nothing that linked James to Silver Ridge Mine or to any military activity in that region. His deployments had been overseas. His training had been conducted at Coronado and other coastal facilities. There was no reason for a Navy SEAL to be in the Nevada desert, no mission that would have required accessing an abandoned mine. The investigation expanded to include the mine itself. Lisa obtained the complete operational history of Silver Ridge, every document related to its construction, operation, and closure. She interviewed former miners who had worked there before 1968, asking about unusual features, hidden chambers, rumors of secret activities. Most of the former miners were elderly, in their 70s and 80s, and their memories of the mine were fragmented. But several mentioned something that caught Lisa's attention during the mine's final years of operation. There had been rumors that not all the tunnels were used for silver extraction, that certain areas had been restricted to workers, that vehicles and equipment had sometimes been seen coming and going at night without explanation. One former miner, a man named Thomas Whitaker, who was 83 years old in 2021, told Lisa a story that had haunted him for decades. In 1967, a year before the mine closed, Thomas had been working a night shift when he heard the sound of a vehicle engine deep in the mine, coming from a section that was supposed to be abandoned. He had gone to investigate and had seen tire tracks in the dust, fresh tracks leading into a tunnel that was marked as structurally unsound and off-limits. Thomas had reported it to his supervisor, who had told him to forget what he had seen, that it was none of his business, that sometimes the company allowed government contractors to use the mine for storage or testing purposes. Thomas had never learned what was being stored or tested, but he remembered feeling deeply uneasy about the whole situation, about the implication that something secret was happening in those tunnels. Lisa followed this lead, researching whether any government agencies had used Silver Ridge Mine for any purpose in the 1960s or early 1970s. She found vague references in declassified documents to underground testing facilities in Nevada, but nothing that specifically mentioned Silver Ridge. She contacted the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and various intelligence agencies, asking if any records existed of activities at the mine. The responses were uniformly unhelpful, ranging from denials that any such activities had occurred to refusals to confirm or deny based on national security concerns. The more Lisa investigated, the more she became convinced that James Harrington had been involved in something classified, something that had brought him to Silver Ridge Mine on November 8, 1972. But what mission or operation would require a Navy SEAL to access an abandoned mine in Nevada? And why would that mission result in his vehicle being left in a sealed chamber for 49 years? Lisa examined the contents of James's duffel bag more carefully, looking for anything that might provide a clue. The maps in the waterproof case included not just standard road maps, but also topographical maps showing the terrain around Silver Ridge Mine. Someone had marked several locations on these maps with pencil, circling areas that appeared to correspond to ventilation shafts and secondary entrances to the mine system. James had known about the mine. He had been planning to access it. This had not been a random detour or an accident. This had been intentional. The documents related to the Harrington family property were also revealing upon closer examination. Mixed in with legitimate county records and property deeds was a letter, handwritten, addressed to James at his Coronado address. The letter was unsigned and undated, but the content was specific and urgent. It read, "The site has been compromised. They know about the cache. You need to retrieve the materials before they move them or destroy the evidence. Use the third-level access point we discussed. Do not contact me after this. Burn this letter." James had not burned the letter. He had kept it, had brought it with him on what would be his final drive. Lisa had the letter analyzed by forensic document examiners, who determined it had been written in early November 1972, consistent with James receiving it shortly before his disappearance. The handwriting could not be matched to any known sample, and there were no fingerprints on the paper other than James's. What cache was the letter referring to? What materials needed to be retrieved? Who had written the letter? And what was the connection to Silver Ridge Mine? Lisa expanded her investigation to include a search of all mine records for any mention of storage, catching, or unusual deposits of non-mineral materials. She found nothing in official documents, but she did find something interesting in a collection of personal journals donated to the Nevada State Mining Museum by the widow of Silver Ridge's final operations manager. The operations manager, a man named Gerald Foster, had kept detailed daily logs of activities at the mine during his tenure from 1965 to 1968. Most entries were routine, documenting production numbers, equipment maintenance, but in entries from late 1966 and early 1967, Gerald noted several instances of what he called external use authorizations, times when military or government personnel had been given access to restricted areas of the mine. Gerald's tone in these entries suggested he had been uncomfortable with these arrangements, that he had felt excluded from knowing what was happening in sections of his own mine, but that he had been instructed by the company ownership to cooperate fully and not ask questions. In an entry from January 1967, Gerald wrote, "They brought in 3 trucks last night, heavy cargo, sealed containers. Took them down to 3rd level, section C. I was told to keep all workers away from that area for 72 hours. No explanation given. When I asked what was being stored, I was told it was government property and that asking questions would be a violation of national security. This is my mine, and I don't even know what's being hidden in it." Section C of the 3rd level was the area where James Harrington's car had been found 4 years after Gerald Foster wrote that journal entry. Lisa now had a working theory. The government, or some agency operating under government authority, had used Silver Ridge Mine in the 1960s to cache materials that needed to be stored secretly underground. James Harrington, as part of his SEAL duties or as part of some classified operation, had been tasked with retrieving those materials in November 1972. Something had gone wrong. James had entered the mine, had driven his car down to the 3rd level using some access point that was later destroyed in the 1973 collapse, and had encountered something that prevented him from leaving. But where was James's body? If he had died in the mine, his remains should have been in or near the car. If he had been killed by someone else, there should have been evidence of violence. The complete absence of James himself was the part of the mystery that Lisa could not explain. A car could be left behind. Equipment could be abandoned. But a trained Navy SEAL did not simply vanish from a sealed underground chamber without leaving a trace. Lisa made a decision that she knew would be controversial. She requested permission to conduct a full forensic excavation of the chamber and the surrounding tunnels, looking for any evidence of what had happened to James Harrington. The request was initially denied by the mining company that owned the property, who cited safety concerns and the cost of such an operation. Lisa elevated the request through FBI channels, eventually getting approval from the Department of Justice to proceed with the excavation as part of an official investigation into the death of a military service member. The excavation took 3 weeks and involved teams of miners, structural engineers, forensic specialists, and military investigators. Every inch of the chamber was examined. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the surrounding rock for voids or hidden passages. Samples were taken from the floor, looking for traces of blood, bone, or any biological material that might indicate James had been present. The excavation revealed 2 significant findings. First, there was indeed a passage from the chamber, a narrow natural fissure in the limestone that had been widened slightly, just enough to allow a person to squeeze through. The passage led upward at a steep angle, eventually emerging in a ventilation shaft that reached the surface approximately 300 yards from the main mine entrance. This explained how James could have accessed the chamber even after the main tunnels had become unsafe or blocked. He could have entered through the ventilation shaft, descended to the 3rd level, and driven his car into the chamber using some route that was later destroyed in the collapse. The second finding was more disturbing. On the floor of the chamber, partially hidden beneath a rock outcropping, investigators found a small cache of items that had clearly been left by James. There was a notebook with handwritten entries, a compass, a military issue knife, and a sealed metal container approximately the size of a briefcase. The container was locked, and when opened by explosive ordnance disposal technicians who were concerned it might be booby-trapped, it was found to contain documents, photographs, and what appeared to be biological samples in preserved vials. The documents were classified, stamped with markings indicating they were related to biological weapons research conducted by the United States in the 1960s as part of a program that was supposed to have been terminated in 1969. The photographs showed laboratory facilities, test subjects, and results of experiments that were clearly meant to remain secret. The biological samples, when analyzed by specialists from the Centers for Disease Control, were identified as preserved cultures of modified pathogens, rendered inactive through chemical treatment, but still containing genetic material that could theoretically be used to recreate the original organisms. James Harrington had found the cache. He had retrieved the materials that the unsigned letter had instructed him to secure, but he had never left the mine. His notebook, which Lisa read with growing horror, documented his last hours. The entries began on November 8, 1972, around midnight. James wrote that he had entered the mine through the ventilation shaft, had navigated to the 3rd level, and had located the cache exactly where he had been told it would be. He described unsealing the container and examining the contents, realizing immediately that he was looking at evidence of illegal weapons research that should have been destroyed years earlier. He wrote that he understood now why he had been sent to retrieve these materials, that someone in the military or intelligence community wanted this evidence to be recovered before it could be found by the wrong people or used to expose operations that were supposed to remain hidden. But something had gone wrong. James wrote that he had heard sounds in the mine, footsteps and voices echoing through the tunnels, approaching his location. He realized he was not alone, that someone else knew about the cache and had come to secure it. James made a decision. He could not let the materials fall into the wrong hands, but he also could not risk carrying them out if he was being pursued. He drove his car into the chamber, hid the cache, and prepared to exit through the ventilation shaft, planning to come back later with support to retrieve the materials properly. The final entry in James's notebook was dated November 9, 1972, approximately 20:00 a.m. He wrote, "I made it to the ventilation shaft, climbing out now. Someone is below, searching for me. I can hear them calling my name, but the voice is wrong, sounds wrong. I don't trust it. I'm getting out. I'll report this as soon as I reach the surface. This needs to go up the chain. Someone needs to answer for what's in those files." That was the last thing James Harrington ever wrote. He had climbed the ventilation shaft, had presumably reached the surface, and then had vanished so completely that not even his body would be found for 49 years. Lisa Chen stood in the chamber where James's car sat, holding the notebook, trying to understand what had happened after he reached the surface. Had someone been waiting for him? Had he been killed to prevent him from reporting what he had found? But if he had been killed, where was his body? And why had his car been left in the mine, untouched for decades? Lisa pursued the investigation into the biological weapons cache, attempting to trace who had ordered the materials to be hidden in Silver Ridge Mine and who might have known that James was coming to retrieve them. She ran into immediate resistance. The documents James had recovered were classified at the highest levels. Lisa's security clearance allowed her to confirm that the program referenced in the files had existed and had been officially terminated, but she could not access details about who had worked on the program, where the research had been conducted, or what had happened to the materials when the program shut down. Lisa submitted reports to her superiors, documenting everything she had found, laying out a theory that James Harrington had been killed by someone who wanted to prevent the exposure of illegal biological weapons research. She requested that the case be elevated to a joint task force involving military criminal investigators and intelligence oversight. Her requests were denied. She was told that the matter was being handled through classified channels, that her investigation had reached its conclusion with the recovery of James's car and personal effects, and that the family should be notified that James Harrington was presumed to have died in November 1972 while on unofficial business that may have involved classified materials. Caroline Harrington, James's 74-year-old sister, was flown to Nevada in May 2021 to be briefed on the discovery and to receive her brother's personal effects. Lisa met with Caroline in a quiet office at the FBI field office in Las Vegas, presenting the evidence that had been recovered and explaining, as much as she was allowed, what James had been doing in Silver Ridge Mine. Caroline listened with the stoic composure of someone who had lived with uncertainty for 49 years and had finally received partial answers. When Lisa finished, Caroline asked the only question that still mattered to her: "Where is my brother? Where is James? Lisa had no answer. The investigation had found James's car, his belongings, his notebook, the cash he had been sent to retrieve. But James himself remained missing, his fate unknown, his body never recovered. Caroline accepted this with a sadness that spoke to decades of hoping for closure that would never fully arrive. She took possession of James's personal effects, the duffel bag and its contents, the military insignia that had hung from his rearview mirror. The notebook and the cash were retained as classified materials. The Silver Ridge mine was resealed in June 2021. The mining company that had planned to reopen the facility decided that the costs and complications were not worth the potential profit, especially given the discovery of classified materials and the ongoing questions about what else might be hidden in the tunnels. The chamber where James's car had been found was intentionally collapsed, buried under tons of rock, returning to the sealed state it had been in for most of the previous 5 decades. James Harrington's Dodge Charger was removed and transported to a military facility where it was processed as evidence before eventually being returned to Caroline, who donated it to the National Navy SEAL Museum in Fort Pierce, Florida, where it remains on display as a memorial to a warrior who died in service to his country under circumstances that may never be fully explained. Lisa Martinez continued to work the case unofficially, pursuing leads in her spare time, trying to identify who had sent James to the mine and who might have been responsible for his disappearance. She compiled a file that grew to over 300 pages, documenting every connection, every classified program that might have been involved, every person who had access to information about the biological weapons cache. But she never found the smoking gun, never identified the person or persons who had made the decision to send a Navy SEAL into an abandoned mine to retrieve evidence of illegal research and then failed to bring him home. In 2023, 2 years after the discovery of James's car, Lisa retired from the FBI. She passed her unofficial files to a journalist she trusted, a woman who specialized in investigating historical injustices and government cover-ups. The journalist wrote a series of articles about James Harrington, about the biological weapons program, about the questions that remained unanswered. The articles generated public interest and media coverage, putting pressure on government agencies to provide more transparency about what had happened in 1972. But the pressure yielded little new information. The Department of Defense confirmed that James Harrington had been a Navy SEAL who had died under classified circumstances in 1972, that his remains had never been recovered, and that the details of his final mission remained protected by national security considerations. The official position was that James had died serving his country, that his family deserved recognition of his sacrifice, but that full disclosure of the circumstances would compromise ongoing intelligence operations and could not be provided. Caroline Harrington died in 2024 at the age of 77, 3 years after learning what had happened to her brother's car, but still not knowing what had happened to James himself. She left behind letters and recordings in which she spoke about James, about the brother she remembered, about the warrior who had vanished in the Nevada desert and whose fate remained one of the enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. Those recordings now exist in archives, preserving the voice of a sister who never stopped hoping for answers, who never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, the full truth would eventually be known. James Harrington's car sits in a museum, a memorial to a mystery that was partially solved but never fully explained. Visitors can see the green and black Dodge Charger, can read the placard describing how it was found in an impossible location, can look at photographs of the underground chamber and the investigation that followed. But what they cannot see, what may never be known, is what happened to James after he climbed out of that ventilation shaft on November 9, 1972. Did someone kill him to silence him? Was his body hidden so thoroughly that it will never be found? Or did something else happen, something even more disturbing than murder? Something that explains why a trained Navy SEAL could vanish from a remote desert location without leaving a single trace. The mine is sealed. The cache has been secured. The car has been recovered. But James Harrington remains missing, lost somewhere between the moment he reached the surface and the present day. His disappearance a testament to operations that remain classified, to decisions that were made without public oversight, to sacrifices that will never be fully acknowledged or mourned. Some mysteries end with bodies and closure, some end with confessions and justice, and some end with cars found in impossible places, notebooks filled with final words, and families left wondering whether the truth was buried along with the evidence, sealed away in chambers that will never be reopened, hidden in files that will never be declassified, lost in a darkness that extends far beyond the abandoned tunnels of an old silver mine in Nevada.